making it earlier. Well, one thing is that Ymchwil, which is the enclave of in the United States, is gonna be celebrated in California this year. So please get your abstracts in, John, so that you can come to California in October. Okay, so let's get it started. Today, I'm going to be talking about the acquisition of Basque ergativity, both in terms of its production and social meaning. And this is still work in progress. So of course, your feedback and your insights will be very, very helpful. And feel free to cut me if there is something that is not clear or understandable. So unmute yourselves, don't feel, I want this to be more of a conversation. So I'm starting with the premise or the general claim that is oftentimes done within the acquisition of social linguistic variation, at least in adult L2 learners, that this tends to be quite hard or particularly challenging. And one of the reasons for that is that learners' social linguistic competence involves a lot of different stuff, including the frequencies of the target variants, the independent linguistic and social factors that constrain them, the ordering of the ranking of these linguistic factors, and finally, acquiring the social meaning behind this use of language. So on itself is quite complex, a lot of information that L2 speakers need to learn. However, there are several problems that still haven't been addressed. And oftentimes, so although usage-based approach to language acquisition have addressed this question quite a lot, there is less information within the variationist, relatively less work is done. So what is the role of frequency in acquiring language variation? And it depends on, well, how frequency is being measured, because oftentimes it tends to interact with other kind of factors. Another problem that we see in language acquisition or acquisition of social linguistic variation is that most of these studies tend to be done in migrant and study abroad contexts. And it depends on what kind of context, social networks, learning context, time spent, depending on the variable, dependent variable, will have also different kind of results. And less work has been done on revitalization context, like the one in Welsh and in the Basque case. And then the problem is, what is the target that we are trying to aim to? So although there is now a pluricentric understanding of language variation and also language acquisition, native speech models still tend to be assumed and not necessarily questioned. So the question now becomes, what is language, or how is language variation acquired in language revitalization context, where new speakers are the majority, and also the one that challenges oftentimes native speech models? So I'm going to introduce very briefly what new speakers or what the work on new speakers have done. So they have been defined as individuals with little or no home or community exposure to minority language, and instead acquired through immersion or bilingual education program, revitalization projects, or adult language learners. So of course, this is one of the earliest definitions that was put out there by O'Rourke. Of course, it's not the most complete one, right? And it's not without its problems. But basically, the goal of this trajectory of new speakers is to move away from evaluative models of the speakerhood and understand how is it that in this new context of language revitalization, these minoritized languages are being learned, how are the new identities emerging? And it has been described as an emic category in the sense that not everybody has a term for new speaker in this context. In the Basque country, we do. But not everybody understands new speaker in the same way. But at least it allows us to have a framework from which to start questioning models of the speakerhood. So in the recent years, we have seen new work coming up with respect to language variation and change, acquisition, so marrying these kind of three branches, because most of the work on new speakers have been done on identity issues and not necessarily on production. But this is starting to change in the past few years. So one of the things that we are seeing is that new varieties and new vernaculars are emerging. Also, this work has cast doubt the idea of the speech community that has also been criticized in the LVC literature in other contexts. One of the things they say, what are the social factors that lead to the different variation? And in some contexts, we have seen that the peer influence tend to be more important than home language or home input effects. That by the age, by the end of primary school, children are starting to have more of a leveling pattern, or at least this is the case in certain contexts. We have also seen that changing dominances can also lead to the acquisition of certain forms that are not as easy or whatever. And then there are also different outcomes depending on the new speaker context. And John Morris has been pretty good at showing this within the Welsh context. So, however, certain gaps that we can still see is that most of this understanding, and not surprisingly, is that more phonetic variables tend to be favored in the understanding. Morphosyntactic acquisition is not that much studied from these lenses in the new speaker and the LVC literature. And people tend to focus either on the production or the perception. So here I want to be able to target both. So what are my goals? My goals are to examine the acquisition and the social meaning of Basque ergativity, which is a morphosyntactic variation variable. And these are the research questions that I will be addressing. What social factors promote the use of Basque ergativity? Whether frequency-related factors affect the use of ergativity, and here I'm going to be looking at two, one social and one linguistic, and then what is the social meaning of Basque ergativity. So just to give you a snapshot, or these are the main findings. New speakers they omit Basque ergativity more times, but they do tend to reallocate these internal factors based on lexical frequency, and I will show you in a minute. And then at the same time, the social meaning of ergativity is different for traditional speakers and to new speakers. And the new speakers do transgress some of these standard language ideologies. So a little bit about the Basque country. Is located between Spain and France. And Basque has been in contact with Latin and Spanish, with Romance languages for over 2,000 years. And for the most of its history, Basque was an oral language and subjugated to the home domain until 1968, when the standard Basque gets created, and then it becomes official with the Basque within the Basque autonomous community. So only in these three provinces, in the purple ones. And then in 1982, there is the implementation of this standard becomes part of the education project called the law of normalization of Basque allows this to do this. And this is where new speakers, there is a huge resurrection of new speakers in this particular context. So here we see that once a standard Basque gets created, today, at least in the Basque autonomous community, the majority of young kids do have at least certain knowledge of Basque. However, the landscape has changed quite dramatically, whereas in 1991, the vast majority of Basque speakers were considered traditional speakers or native Basque speakers. That has changed, especially among the youth. So today we can see here in the gray area that the majority of Basque youth are in fact new Basque speakers. This means that the majority of Basque speakers today learn the language through immersion programs or as adult literacy schools, but mainly through the immersion programs. So of course, there's going to be a lot of variation as to how these new speakers use the language and the motivations and identity affiliations that they have. So in fact, new work has shown that contrary to other contexts that oftentimes tend to speak in terms of dichotomies between traditional and new speaker or native speaker and new speaker, in the Basque case, three terms tend to be used, and that the speakers themselves situate themselves in this continuum. So on one side, we have what is considered the traditional ones, Euskaldun Zaharra, or what would be the native people. And these are usually associated with people who speak a regional variety. And they're also the ones that are considered more legitimate speakers. In the other side of the continuum, we have the new speakers. They're associated with the standard, and they do not enjoy such much legitimacy or authenticity as Basque speakers for having learned the language in school. But now this dichotomy is being contested by some speakers. And some people say, I am not Euskaldun Berri. I am not Euskaldun Zahar. I am just a Basque speaker. And this is the term in the middle. So these people generally, they might have started learning the standard Basque, but they're starting to pick on some aspects of the regional varieties that are more in a continuum. They also claim to have more authenticity than those considered Euskaldun Berri, but less so than Euskaldun Zaharra because they didn't learn the language at home necessarily. Of course, this is just some of the speakers. Not everybody might define it as such. So one of the things that we know is that Batua is associated again with artificiality and with new speakers. But there is again starting to have some dialect mixing and language mixing with respect to vernacularization process of standard Basque are starting to happen. So let's look at Basque ergativity. So from the grammatical standpoint, Basque ergativity is basically this little marker that you put in subjects of transitive and anergative verbs, whereas an accusative subject, such as to come, would be marked with 0. Notice as well that in Basque, the auxiliary verb, so the verb is formed by the lexical verb, ikusi, and then we have the auxiliary verb. So the auxiliary verb is going to be basically a bunch of different morphemes in agreement with all the different elements in the sentence. So for instance, here the ergative is going to be appearing at the end, also agreeing with the subject, the first person singular. So here I'm only going to be focusing on the nominal inflection, basically this little k, the extent to which is being produced or not. I will not be focusing on the verb at all, just the nominal inflection. So just these are some of the debates in syntactic theory that I'm not going to get into. But one of the things that I want to mention is that in the literature it has been suggested that this ergativity tends to be omitted sometimes. And this has to do with the phonological rules of the language. So for instance, ergative K tends to be omitted preconsonantally and also lenited prevocalically. This is the rule. So when there are two consonants or two stops, one of them is going to be deleted, and usually is the ergative, the one that tends to be omitted. Within the morphology, distributed morphology has been, the following rule has been also suggested. The ergative subject K can serve as absolutive 0 in some standard spoken Basque varieties, but they have never asked or they have never shown what are the linguistic or the social constraints that lead for this variability, which is the goal of this study. And finally, one of the things that we know is that children, bilingual children, tend to take longer to acquire this morphological feature, and that basically that the ergative option on stage tends to last a little bit longer. Other work has shown with MRIs and as well as with ERPs that L2 adults tend to process the ergative slightly differently. So sometimes they might not be aware, or they might not process mistakes or the omissions of the ergative the same way as so-called native speakers would do. Basically, there are some differences in their perception or in the processing, basically. So with respect to metalinguistic pragmatic commentaries, so people are aware that there is this famous K that makes us unique with the European context, that Basque is an ergative language, right? But this is a traditional speaker saying that it is the new speakers that have a problem with this, with respect to the notion of transitivity and intransitivity. So here, for instance, the person is mixing. So nik nice instead of nik egin dut, and ni egin dut versus nik egin dut, right? So here mismatches with the auxiliary verb and the ergative. So basically, but adducing this to new speakers. With respect to another social linguistic meaning, oftentimes it's associated with authenticity. So here we have a comic strip that is very common in the newspaper in the Basque country. Here we have Yoda, and this other priest is representing a figure of the Basque Academy in this particular context. So Irati is a place where there's a lot of different texts, and within the Basque country, historically, there's still this idea to understand where we actually come from as one of the isolated languages of Europe, right? So of course, documents are going to be our best bet to understand that. So here we have Yoda talking to the priest saying, Lord, here are the last documents from Belaya, which is a place in the Basque country where a lot of documents about Basque have been found. And then the priest says, still dealing with that? I say, yes, sir. But tell me, does ergative appear there? No, sir, not a trace. Those are fake documents, damn it, that's not real Basque. So here we can see the Basque ergativity is also linked to some kind of authenticity. And in many cases, as a legitimate Basque speaker. There are other kind of cases. Of course, this strip is mocking that, but it still reflects some of the ideologies that we can see circulating within the context. Okay, so my production data comes from the Basque Romance corpus that I created myself, and I collected data from 3 different parts of the Basque country. Today, I will only be focusing on the red and the green ones. So The red are going to be where traditional speakers are located. And whereas this is Guernica, this is my hometown. And this line over here represents the varieties. So the context, what we call the traditional Basque speaking context, where Basque varieties were still, original varieties were being used before the standard variety was in fact implemented. Whereas in Bilbao, the Basque, the regional variety of Basque there was lost in the 19th century, and then a standard Basque was implemented in the 60s, early 70s, right? So the newest speakers here are going to be coming from Bilbao. Then self-claim Euskaldun, right? There are only 4 here. And finally, these are the traditional ones, or self-claimed traditional. So these are people that they have claimed themselves. And I also looked at proficiency as well with some kind of test. But we will see that in fact, it is self-identification a better predictor of variation. So this is where I conducted my social linguistic interviews. So this is a barnetegia, which means a place of the interior. This is basically an adult literacy school where you can, it's a boarding school where you can go there and spend 24 hours immersed in the Basque language. And then I also conducted in social linguistic interviews in the Euskaltegia, which is in Bilbao. And underneath there is a bar. And this is particularly important because it wasn't the cleanest data at all for many cases, right? But this is where much of the socialization of Basque tends to happen. So these are some enclaves within Bilbao that are important to consider. Okay, so one of the questions that I asked was, what kind of a speaker do you consider yourself to be? So here we have Sara. So in this respect, I followed Mendoza Denton's emergent participation self-identification categories. How is it that they see themselves and how is it that they define themselves? So here we see Sara saying that we are new speakers of Basque because we started learning Basque at the age of 3 in school. Very clear definition. School and later than is not their mother tongue, basically. Dani, for instance, considers himself Euskaldun. And here it adduces to the parenthood as well. So I asked, do you feel Euskaldun, Sar, traditional speaker? No, and I'm surprised because I actually went to school with this person, right? And he speaks original variety. So he says, my parents are Andalusian, which is south of Spain. Well, I don't know if I'm Euskaldun, Sar, because I've always been wondering that. Euskaldun is someone who knows Basque. The word itself means that, Basque owner. I don't know. I think I am Euskaldun, period. Basically taking his agency. I own the language, right? Even if it wasn't given to me. So in this respect, he considers himself Euskaldun and not necessarily a native speaker, but is still an owner of the language itself. And here we have an Edith who considers herself a new speaker. And not everybody feels the way she's going to define herself, but here we see some of the junctures that she kind of feels. How being a new speaker means that you have to still try and work hard in your abilities to speak Basque. So she says, now I speak Basque badly. My husband is Euskaldun, you better believe it. And with him, never. So I speak English, I speak sign language. But for instance, Italian, I speak it badly, but I'm calm and I speak it. But Basque is different. I feel a lot of pressure. And then she goes on to say, and on top of that, I'm independentist. Just imagine, it embarrasses me. Yeah, it embarrasses me not to know Basque. And on top of that, people think I am Euskaldun. It is my obstacle. It is here in my head, and it's a psychological problem. So here we see that speaking, being an independentist comes with the idea that you have to speak Basque fluently, and that you would use it with the people that have transgressed this new speaker category. But she's still stuck in there. At least this is how she saw herself. Okay, so once I collected the social linguistic interviews, I coded for the presence or absence of this ergative K in just in the nominal inflection, right? And then I coded it for different linguistic factors. So the most important one tends to be verb type, remember transitive and negative sentences, also the phonological context, animacy and person, and then the type of the MP, whether it's a pronoun, whether it's a lexical MP, or whether it's a name. In terms of the social factors, I looked at how they self-identify themselves. What is their self-claimed language use? Basically, how much Basque they use in a daily life. What is their proficiency on Basque based on testing? I will be happy to talk about whether that's reliable or not. And then finally, sex. And I also looked at lexical frequency to understand to what extent frequency does aid in that. And here I did follow Erker and Guy, who basically suggested that, who found certain effects of frequency, but not main effects, mediating effects. So basically, lexical verbs that comprise more than 1% of the entire data, so in this case, it was 20 times. If that verb was produced at least 20 times within the corpus, it was considered frequent. And then one of the things that I did was I separated the frequent verbs and then infrequent verbs, and then ran a bunch of different stats. And if there was a factor that was significant in that particular model, right, the linguistic factor, that would constitute, but not in the infrequent model, that would constitute that frequency effects are being mediated somehow with another linguistic factor. So let's look at the results. So by looking at the proficiency, one of the things that we see is that proficiency and self-identification do co-vary in the model. But then when we look at which model is more optimal or explains more of the variation, we find out that it is in fact the self-identification one. There's less residuals in that respect. So I'm going to focus on these three different groups. So after that, so here we see that the three different verbs with the three different groups. So one of the things that we notice is that everybody omits the ergative K to some extent. I think there is only one person who is a new speaker who produces it 100% of the time, at least with an ergative verb. But other than that, omissions of ergativity are very, 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 very common, although that variation is more pronounced among new speakers. Another thing that we can say is that those who consider themselves Basque speakers, they're very close to how traditional speakers use Basque ergativity, at least when it comes to the frequencies. And then another thing that we notice is that the use of ergative with an accusative subjects is very, very, very rare. Not even if it's salient for some of the speakers, it rarely gets produced. But when so then what I did is that I took each of the three social groups, and then I ran different models to understand what are the linguistic factors that lead to the use of ergativity, and then whether frequency effects of the lexical verb mediate those linguistic factors. And here you're going to see that in red, I mark those in which lexical frequencies do have a mediating effect in those. So black is going to mean that there is no effect whatsoever at all. So, and then the hierarchical constraint analysis shows that the higher the linguistic factor, the most important it is. So when we look at those in new speaker group, we see that the verb type is the most important linguistic factor and is not mediated by lexical frequency effects. But there are the three are. What this means is that within the phonological context, in those contexts in which the lexical verbs are going to be frequent, they are more likely to produce the ergative. And this is going to happen especially when the next segment is a vowel. So this is following what Welde has said, at least for the stop deletion rule. With respect to animacy and person, one of the things that we say is that it is third person singular inanimate subjects that get omitted the least. So here we see the reverse effect, right? In the sense that subjects that are inanimate and third person singular, so such as the table or something like that, would get less ergativity, especially in contexts that have more frequent verbs. And then finally, what we see here is that the type of MP also does matter. So pronouns are more likely to produce ergativity if it's also produced with frequent lexical verbs. And names are going to be less so. So when we go to the group Euskaldun, one of the things that we see is that the same patterns emerge, except that animacy and person do not matter. That effect goes, and that only the type of MP is subjugated to some lexical frequency effects. And when we look at traditional ones, lexical frequency effects do not matter. And the only two linguistic factors that matter are verb type, phonological context, but it's still following the trend, and it is in fact sex. So it looks like women are more likely to produce the ergative case marker. So what does this all mean? So very briefly, what social factors promote the use of Basque ergativity? So here we see that self-claim authenticity, it is the strongest predictor. When we look at frequency-related factors, self-claim language use is not a predictor at all. But what we do see is that there is lexical frequency effects consistent with other literature and also acquisition of ergativity in children in other languages as well. So these are some effects of the subject itself within the discourse that I will talk about. When we look at frequency, one of the things that we see is that there is a mediating effect from phonological context only for those who speak the standard, the two groups, the new speakers and the Basque group, right? And basically showing that high frequent prevocalic contexts are acquired first. So this could suggest that lenition in itself could be, which is common in this context, could be used as a cue in potentially acquiring Basque ergativity, but this is something that has to be tested further. When we look at the type of MP, one of the things that we see is that it follows this typological trend whereby ergativity is going to be produced more likely with the first and second person, then third person singular animates, and then third person singular inanimates. So this is relatively consistent with arguments in the generative literature suggesting and child language acquisition that person marking in the verbal morphology could be helping here in the sense that notice that in the third person singular, ergative in the verb is null, it's zero, it doesn't get marked. So it has been argued that in fact, this will make harder for learners to pick on the need of ergativity. Whereas this is true or not, it does not explain the animacy effect because animacy so here what we see is that it is in fact inanimate subjects, third person singular subjects that are less likely to be marked. So what explains this animacy effect? And I don't think it's only about an animacy, but I do believe that it has to do with the frequency effects in discourse that has been shown for discourse-based accounts of ergativity in other languages. So one of the things that we know is that third person inanimate objects, or third person non-pronouns, which is where this gets, so lexical MPs tend to introduce new information. And when new information is being introduced, ergativity is not necessarily as required. Or at least there is more variation in that respect. At least this is what Dubois' preferred argument structure has argued. Some evidence in favor of that could be by looking at the omissions. In fact, they are in certain pragmatic contexts. So for instance, omissions are very common even among native speakers in topic shifts, emphasis, and also introducing self in the narrative, especially with certain lexical items. Me, for instance, blah, 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 blah. Extensions to inaccusative context tend to also be rule governed. They don't happen randomly. And this has been shown in context of topicalization. So even if these omissions of these extensions happen, it's very hard to say that these are in fact errors. In fact, they are following certain discourse in the certain functions within the discourse. But this has to be investigated further. Okay, so now I'm interested in looking at what is the social meaning behind this production or this variability. So for that, I conducted a Ymchwil experiment in which 4 stimuli, all read by the same female, the same person, and the 4 different target guises, which were exactly the same, except whether they had ergativity production or not. So here I crossed the regional variety and ergativity. So for instance, we had this text with all the case marks in the regional, then I omitted all the case, the same for standard, and so with ergative production and with no ergative production. And then I gave them, so there were 40 listeners that completed a semantic differential escape questionnaire. So in here, I'm only interested in these 3 questions, which is, this person sounds new or traditional or native speaker, how authentically is this Basque, and does this person make mistakes? So to see to what extent those 3 social aspects are related to one another. So this would be, they will be from a 1 to 7 scale. So this is what they actually saw. So to the question, does this person sound new or traditional? Ergativity has no bearing whatsoever. Here, what we see is that, so here and the guises here are Guernica Basque, which is the regional variety of most of the traditional speakers here. It says no ergativity. Then we have Guernica Basque with ergativity. Here we have the standard Basque, no ergativity, and here is standard Basque with ergativity. So one of the things that we see is that traditional speakers are associated with the regional variety, period. And this is consistent throughout the entire three groups. And ergativity, it does not make you sound more standard or more new speaker or more traditional speaker in itself. However, how Basque does this person sound? One of the things that we see is that for those who speak a standard Basque, it doesn't matter. Again, you are gonna be very Basque if you use the regional variety. You're still Basque if you use the standard, just a little bit less authentic, right? However, there is an effect in traditional speakers. So traditional speakers associate lack of ergativity in a standard Basque as being less Basque. So here we have a hierarchy behind that. And then when we talk about does this person make mistakes, one of the things that we see is that, so there's a continuum that gets emerged here. So the new speaker group, nothing, everything is the same. Nobody's making as many mistakes, right? However, for the group Euskaldun, right, you can see that sure, the standard Basque of a person when doesn't use ergativity is making significantly more mistakes than when using the standard Basque with the ergativity. However, notice that they do not notice that in Guernica Basque, when there is no production of ergativity, some do not notice that those are being omitted. And what is interesting is that those people from Guernica, the traditional group, they also judge the standard Basque with no ergativity having more mistakes than the standard Basque. But notice also that many of them do not notice that they themselves, the guys who is not using ergativity in their variety, they do not notice that. So lack of ergativity in Guernica Basque goes unnoticed for many as well. So what does this all mean? So one of the things that we see is that, well, traditional speakers show additional kind of indexical relations. So lower values of Basqueness were also associated with new speakers. And this was a correlation that was quite positive. And higher values of mistakes were associated with new speakers. So here are some, well, I'm gonna move forward for the sake of it. So one of the things that we see is that new speakers are associated with batua and less authenticity. And the use of ergativity does influence only those who do not use a standard Basque, right? So it is the ones in the regional variety that judge them more about it. So the question is, why would new speakers show different associations with ergative formation? So one might argue is that socioindexical relations of variants may be hard to acquire, and maybe they have failed to acquire that. One of the questions is how salient is ergative K in the guises and within the spontaneous speech? Are they really noticing? One of the things that we do see is that when they do notice, it looks like the standard Basque guise tends to be more noticeable as not producing that ergative K. So here I want to argue that although we have to look at how salient it is for them when the K is being omitted or not, or produced, right? I want to argue that that it is in fact different socializations that give rise to different kind of social meanings of Basque ergativity. So new speakers are aware that this ergativity is important. So the social meaning of Basque ergativity is not necessarily as ordered for Batua speakers, right? So Basque speakers do associate with mistakes, but it is not necessarily, it doesn't make you less authentic. Although for traditional speakers, it makes you less authentic, it makes you more traditional, and it makes you sound as you are making more mistakes. So it could be that those new speakers that say, sure, I'm making mistakes, but what am I gonna make? That doesn't make me less Basque, whatever. So it could be that they might be, they might have different disposition of self to others. They do not necessarily wanna sound like native speakers, or it could be that they're just giving themselves a break of saying, okay, well, I'm learning this language. I don't need to sound like traditional speakers in this sense, right? Basque is what makes me Basque, period, not the ergative. That could be. So some of the conclusions that we can draw from here is that new speakers are more variable in their omissions of K, not surprising, but they do show consistent mastery of the internal constraints, and these get reallocated gradually through lexical frequency effects. So the reallocation of linguistic constraints and the social meaning of ergativity pertain to the kind of social practices that these speakers engage in. So one of the things that we see is that it is Basque speakers that in the production, they actually produce similar to new speakers, so traditional speakers, sorry. So, and these speakers have claimed to use, or they tend to claim more authenticity because they have extended their linguistic social circles. So oftentimes they do hang out with other traditional speakers. So it looks like by engaging in this kind of social practices, because there are a lot of new speakers that also follow this, but they might start picking up the linguistic pattern of traditional speakers. So another important thing that we see here is that, or the lexical frequency does matter. So it could be that social linguistic variation is acquired in a piecemeal fashion, right? And how is it being used in context so that L2 speakers are in fact attuned to those kind of effects. And then another important thing that we see here is that Standard Basque, it is not necessarily considered the legitimate variety of Basque speakers. In fact, so which means that understanding the lexical relations of these variants within this context, it's going to be different because we cannot assume that the standard varieties are going to have any kind of overt prestige that is very common in other kind of contexts. What that means is that in LBC, the hegemony of the standard varieties cannot be taken as a default model, and here the different social meanings that is attributed to the different variation is going to be probably the result of alternative markets that we have in this kind of linguistic context of revitalization. So with that, I would like to stop here and I'll be happy to take any questions. So, eskerrik asko, diolch.